On 12 January 1964, a band of some 300 people violently seized the island of Unguja in what became known as the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964. This group was ostensibly led by a little-known man named John Okello, who had lived on Pemba Island, having come to the islands some years earlier from Uganda. The elected government of Zanzibar was overthrown and the Sultan deposed in this violent revolution. This act reversed 200 years of Arab dominance on the political and economic life of Zanzibar and ensured that, contrary to British policy during colonial rule, the islands would be primarily African in nature rather than Arab. It did, however, have a dark side, as it is estimated that up to about 20,000 people may have been killed during this revolution. This is a story about Zanzibar's bloody revolution of January 1964. To understand the Zanzibari Revolution, one must first understand the history of Zanzibar. Some 35 kilometers off the East African coast, Zanzibar consists of two main islands, Unguja, also known as Zanzibar Island, and Pemba, and also a number of smaller adjacent islands. Its majority Muslim population is dominated by an African community with sizable Arab and Asian minorities. The strategic location of Zanzibar in the Indian Ocean helped to create a historically diverse cosmopolitan society. Trade from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East converged on the islands, bringing with it a multitude of influences. The Portuguese arrived at the end of the 15th century and dominated East Africa's sea trade until the Sultanate of Oman in Southern Arabia ousted the Portuguese from control of the seas north of Mozambique in 1729. The height of Omani power in this territory would come during the reign of Sultan Said during the 1830s and the 1840s as he shifted his seat of power from Oman itself to Zanzibar city, marking the Sultanate as being African-focused rather than Arabic-based. The Sultan's decision to relocate his capital to Zanzibar, however, led to the emigration of thousands of Omanis and other Arabs to the islands. The island's African and Arab populations were said to have lived in peaceful coexistence, that is until the introduction of Omani Arab rule, which helped turn Zanzibar into an epicenter of the East African slave trade. Thus, the Sultan and other Arabs became slaveholders of other African locals and African people brought in from the mainland of East Africa. The subsequent development of a plantation system underpinned by an Arab land-owning class and an African laboring class deeply affected the relations of production on the island as Zanzibar operated as a slave society. It was also during the rule of the Sultanate of Oman that Zanzibar became the world's leading producer of cloves. Cloves had been introduced into Zanzibar early in the 19th century, and the Sultan Said encouraged Arabs to cultivate clove trees in both Zanzibar Island and Pemba, and the spice had become a valuable export commodity in the second half of the century. These cloves, however, relied on slave labor. After a series of incursions by Germans and the French in the European scramble for Africa, British colonial rule arrived in the territory in 1890. While not formally a colony, Zanzibar was by the mid-20th century a British protectorate. In 1897, by which time Zanzibar had become a British protectorate, the legal status of slavery was abolished. Slaves were replaced by itinerant laborers, mainly Africans from the mainland, who were hired seasonally to pick the cloves. Now, when Zanzibar became a British protectorate, British rule accentuated the major ethnic divisions that were already existent in the area. The British administration maintained and sometimes worsened this prejudice by grouping people into solely ethnic compartments, preserving a societal structure that favored Omani Arabs over Africans. Many historians have blamed the tactics of divide and rule that were enforced by the British as being responsible for the increase in racial animosity on the islands. Prior to the 1964 revolution, there were roughly 50,000 Arabs resident in Zanzibar compared to 230,000 mainland Africans and Shirazis. People of mixed African-Persian ancestry were known as Shirazi. There was also a community of about 20,000 Asians. Land, wealth and political power remained concentrated in Arab hands, although the Asian community was prominent in business and trade. And by the 1950s, a political storm was brewing in the territory as anti-colonialism spread across Africa. Subsequently, political parties were formed, and the major parties that emerged were primarily organized along ethnic lines. The first party to be formed was the mainly Arab Zanzibar Nationalist Party, the ZNP, whose political program was modeled on the Marxist Pan-Arabist regime in Egypt. In 1957, the more moderate Afro-Shirazi Party was founded, with their leader being Sheikh Abed Karume. Subsequently, the Zanzibar and Pemba People's Party, the ZPPP, splintered off from the Afro-Shirazi Party. The elections of January 1961 produced a deadlock since of the 22 seats, the ASP and the ZNP each occupied 11 seats. The British then enacted a new seat in Pemba Island, and fresh elections were held in June of 1961, with the ZNP and the ZPPP forming an election coalition. Favored by the voting system, this coalition won 13 seats and the ASP only 10, even though the ASP had the most votes. The ASP alleged that there had been electoral fraud. Turmoil then ensued, leaving 68 people dead. In the pre-independence elections of July of 1963, the Arab-dominated Zanzibar National Party and their allies, the ZPPP, gained a slender majority of seats. Prior to these elections, the ZNP had suffered a minor setback when a group of young militants under the leadership of Abdulrahman Mohammed Babu pulled out of the ZNP to form the Ummah Party. However, this radical left-wing Ummah Party did not field any candidates in this 1963 election. In this election, the Afro-Shirazi Party had polled over 54% of the vote, but due to the arrangement of the constituencies, gained only 13 out of the 31 seats in the National Assembly. For many Africans, these election results of 1963 appeared to rule out the constitutional means of addressing the existing social, political, and economic imbalances within Zanzibar society, and they also stood in contrast to the movement towards freedom that was happening in mainland East Africa. On 10 December 1963, Zanzibar received formal independence from Britain and became a constitutional monarchy under the Sultan Jamshid bin Abdullah. However, the event was met with tension and only limited celebration. Half of Zanzibar's population did not regard it as a significant day, rather the territory set ripe for revolt. In the aftermath of independence, the government exacerbated ill feeling amongst the masses by initiating legislation designed to limit the activities of the press and opposition groups, as well as replacing existing members of the police and bureaucracy with personnel known to support the now ruling party. In the eyes of the revolutionaries, not only had the ZNP stolen the government that the Afro-Shirazi Party deserved, it was also systematically outlawing opposition, a move that made revolution necessary. In addition to all of this, African police officers of mainland origin were dismissed from their jobs. Rather foolishly, the government dismissed the policemen, but as a cost-cutting measure, it did not pay for their immediate repatriation. This left in Zanzibar a group of men with paramilitary training and intimate knowledge of police procedures and a grievance against the government. This precarious situation would finally explode in the early morning of January 12, 1964. This would be in the form of an armed insurrection ostensibly led by the Ugandan ASP member John Okello, later dubbed the Field Marshal of Zanzibar and Pemba. Described as a very charming yet very radical individual, Jono Kello was born in the Lango district found in what was then the Ugandan Protectorate in 1937. At the age of 15, he left and began his journey and found work in several places within East Africa. At different times, Jono Kello worked as a clerk, a servant, a gardener, and did a bunch of other odd work while traveling around East Africa, living at different times in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanganyika. Jono Kello was arrested in Nairobi, Kenya on a charge of rape and was imprisoned for 2 years. At the time, Kenya was a British colony, and so this whole ordeal left Jono Kello with a deep hatred for the British. In 1959, Okello left for the island of Pemba, where he tried to find work in one of the fields. He would also join Sheikh Abed Karume's Afro-Shirazi Party. While there, Jono Kello developed a reputation as a very vocal and radical anti-colonialist. As part of his rhetoric, Okello always used to rebuke British colonial powers, people from the south of Asia, particularly from the subcontinent of India, that had monopolized the commercial life of Zanzibar. Okello also used to rebuke the people of Arabic ethnicity who dominated the political life of the Zanzibar Sultanate. In 1963, Jono Kello left for Zanzibar Island, where he contacted leaders of the Afro-Shirazi Youth Community and Afro-Shirazi Party Youth Organization. While on Zanzibar Island, Okello became a member of the Painting Association, and as a painter, the job offered him a modest salary and also allowed him to travel around the island, allegedly giving him chances to give speeches at the union branches. In reality, this was also his opportunity to organize a coup to overthrow the Sultan. In his free time, Jono Kello formed a small army of determined African patriots, and this army was required to adhere to Jono Kello's strict rules, such as abstinence from sex and no alcohol. Jono Kello was also a very religious man, and he believed that he had been instructed in his dreams by God to break the Arab colonialism and build the revolutionary government of Zanzibar and Pemba. Zanzibar's revolution began at around 3 a.m. on 12 January 1964. The exact details of the planning and conduct of the uprising are difficult to discern with any accuracy. The official account of the revolution, published on the first anniversary, claims that the operation was planned and led by the leader of the Afro-Shirazi party, Sheikh Abid Karume. The authorities in Zanzibar have always maintained that Jono Kello took no part in the planning of the revolution. Zanzibari authorities go on to say that it was decided for security reasons that the Sheikh Karume should be outside Zanzibar when the revolution took place, and that's why he went to Dar es Salaam in mainland Tanganyika. Well, the jury is still out on this version of events. The most accepted version of events surrounding the revolution is that planning seems to have involved radical members of the Afro-Shirazi Youth League in association with Jono Kello. Anyways, a day prior to the launch of the coup, Jono Kello had instructed his forces to murder all Arabs ranging between 18 to 25 years of age, but skip women who were pregnant and old, plus giving mercy to virgins when it came to raping. And so, on this fateful day of 12 January 1964, Jono Kello and his followers launched an assault on the principal police arsenal and barracks at Ziwani, just outside Zanzibar city. Armed with bows, arrows, spears, and an assortment of machetes and automobile springs, Okello and his men swiftly took out 2 sentries and pilfered the modern guns from the armory. They then pinned down scores of Sultanate police who had been asleep and unarmed upstairs. Now, although they were poorly armed, Jono Kello and his men shocked the Zanzibar police force with this sudden attack, and they seized power. The revolutionaries were now the best armed men in Zanzibar, and by noon a growing force of between 200 and 600 people were now fully in support of Jono Kello. This group took over control of the local radio station, the airfield, as well as a second police station before they moved on to the Sultanate headquarters in Stone Town. After marching triumphantly onto Stone Town, Jono Kello went on air on Radio Zanzibar and announced the takeover of Zanzibar, declaring himself the Field Marshal of Zanzibar and Pemba. Jono Kello also ordered the Sultan to kill his own family and later commit suicide, otherwise Okello would have done it himself. However, the Sultan and some members of his cabinet escaped to England, never to return. As all of this was taking place, the Sultan's forces made only one serious attempt to counter-attack the rebels. Their flying squad arrived on the scene about an hour after the defeat of the Ziwani garrison. These 75 or so men had only light-duty firearms and were no match for the now heavily armed battalion of Jono Kello. In an act akin to genocide, Jono Kello and his men killed or imprisoned between 1,000 and 20,000 people who were designated Arab or Asian. In addition to these killings, Jono Kello's supporters committed thousands of rapes and destroyed properties and settlements. Within a few weeks, about 1/3 of the population had either died or fled. Following the targeted slaughter, thousands more were ushered into camps and later forcibly deported. Also, as the revolution was taking place, Babu's Umma party were not initially part of the revolt, but they quickly took control and offered leadership. However, the presence in Zanzibar immediately after the revolution of Umma supporters that were trained in Cuba and were wearing Cuban combat fatigues gave rise to the erroneous belief that the revolution was a Cuban-style military takeover. This explanation fitted British and American preconceptions, giving rise to the fear that Zanzibar might become an African Cuba under communist control. In addition to the loss of life, one of the most unfortunate outcomes of the 1964 Zanzibar Revolution was that the country lost a large number of its best brains and much of its skilled workforce. It has been said that many of the later failures in the development of revolutionary Zanzibar were due to the mass exodus of intellectuals, professionals, and experts that occurred during the revolution. Abeid Karume and Babu were not directly involved in the whole coup process as they were in Tanganyika, but later they went back to Zanzibar where they got a warm reception by John Okello. Immediately after the revolt, on 14 January 1964, a revolutionary council was formed by the Afro-Shirazi Party and the Umma Party as a transitional government. In this council, Abeid Karume led the council as president, and Babu of the Umma Party served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately for the hero Jono Kello, neither Abeid Karume nor Babu wanted anything to do with him. To them, Jono Kello appeared too weak to take on any role in the government of the new country, and so he was subsequently politically sidelined by Karume and Babu. Sheikh Abeid Karume allowed Jono Kello to remain in the post of Chief of Staff of the Army. On 3 February 1964, as Zanzibar was returning to normal, Jono Kello formed a military force known as the Freedom Military Force, and this group included his supporters who were known for patrolling the streets and engaging in looting. Jono Kello's position, however, became increasingly precarious as some of his colleagues began to question his dictatorial behavior, the excesses of terror, and perhaps most significant, his identity. Remember, he was a Ugandan. And so by March, a large part of his military faction had been disarmed by Abeid Karume's supporters. Jono Kello was also barred from entering the country when he tried to return from a trip from the mainland, and he was deported to Tanganyika. Jono Kello was also deported to Kenya from Tanganyika, and then he left Kenya for Kinshasa in the Congo before relocating to Uganda during Idi Amin's first year in power. It is reported that Jono Kello was seen with Idi Amin before he disappeared. It is also thought that Idi Amin saw him as a threat, and that's why he eliminated him. Meanwhile, this violence spilled out beyond the island and into neighboring Tanganyika, which was also forging a new independent identity apart from its colonial past. After much consideration, President Julius Nyerere requested British support, and on January 25, British commanders scattered the 1st Battalion. Other army units in Tanganyika were likewise forced to surrender. This whole affair that had taken place initially in Zanzibar and later spilling over to Tanganyika revealed troubling insights into the fragile security of both Tanganyika and Zanzibar. As a result of all of this, negotiations between Tanganyika and Zanzibar towards unification began in earnest, and by April of 1964, the two merged into the United Republic of Tanganyika and Zanzibar. By the end of 1964, the name was shortened to the United Republic of Tanzania. Following the union, the situation in Zanzibar would further deteriorate and spiral as the Afro-Shirazi Party reigned despotic rule over the islands, torturing and imprisoning any opposition figures, including Umma Party members. This might be a topic for another day. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.